Hello, listeners. Welcome to another emergency episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. I don't have any introductory remarks here. Cousin Marko is on. We're going to talk about what the heck is going on in Russia. There's a lot of confusion, but I think there's also a lot of clarity in here as we think about where we're going for the future. So thank you, Marko, for making the time. Thank you, Cassidy family, for watching my baby as I record this in your guest room. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, I'm coming to you live from the West Bank of New Orleans, not of Palestine. How's it going, Marko?
It's going great. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for being on. I think everybody wants to hear. I think we've developed a little bit of a following that wants to hear what we have to say, and let's not make it complicated. We're recording here on Sunday, June 25th. It's 11:55 Central Time. We'll post this as soon as we record. But yesterday, I thought maybe around this time we'd be talking about the end of Vladimir Putin, and maybe he'd be in the streets and we'd have Gaddafi images and things like that. Instead, Prigozhin has turned around. For all I know, in another 24 hours, it'll be back on again. So, I mean, the first question is just, what the fuck do you think is happening, man? This is some wild stuff.
This is what happens when you take a whole country into a really bungled and poorly thought out conflict. I think it was inevitable that there would be domestic political repercussions. As for what's happening to this particular coup, who knows? I think Prigozhin was probably trying to gauge in those 24 hours how many units of the Russian military were going to join him in some shape, way, or form. And he probably gauged that it wasn't enough. But what's interesting to me is this isn't the first time that a coup gets aborted and then the person who kind of like perpetrated the coup while being exiled is still potentially in the game, in the running in some way, shape, or form to shape the future of Russia. So that's, probably his thinking going forward. But we also don't know where he is, so who knows?
Yep. Do you think it was a coup? I mean, I don't want to get too far into a semantic argument, but I mean, usually with a coup, you seize the means of communication in the capital city, you make sure Putin is under lock and key. More like it was a mutiny. It was an assault really on Moscow there for a second. And this is the other thing that doesn't make any sense. If you believe some of the reporting out there, like Wagner fighters were engaging with Russian air assets and shooting down Russian helicopters, and Russian airmen are dead today at the hands of Prigozhin and his fighters, and just everything's going to be okay. The point being, do you think it was a coup? Do you think that he had in mind that he was going to replace Putin at the head of the table? Or do you think he has something else kind of working there? Somebody tweeted a little while ago, it was the first time I'd seen this idea, the idea that this was a rehearsal for something down the line. But there's also a bunch of other private military companies and militias out there, as we saw with the Chechens steaming down into Rostov, just shouting Allahu Akbar on the streets as they were going there. I don't know. There's a lot to make sense, a lot not that doesn't make sense there.
So let's break up all of those things that you brought up and kind of deal with one after another. First of all, I think that anybody who woke up on Saturday and was like, oh, this is a nothing burger, is an idiot. I'm sorry. And why do I say that? Well, this is the country with the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And some guy took 25,000 of his troops that are loyal to him and not the state, which we should talk about as well, on a Saturday, noon drive to Moscow. Like, this is a big deal. It's a big deal, whether you want to call it a coup. I don't want to get into the semantic issues, just not interesting to me. A guy who leads a PMC, a private military company with 25,000 troops, supposedly, that are loyal to him, had a convoy on the way to Moscow. So that's the first issue. The second issue is you're absolutely correct to point out that there's a plethora of other PMCs in Russia. And for the past 3 to 6 months, it has been increasingly strange to me how this is acceptable for a country that considers itself a great power. You do not outsource or distribute law enforcement and military capability to private companies. I mean, fine, if you want, somebody to run around with State Department officials in like a failed state, you might want to contract some private contractors, fine, sure. The United States uses PMCs too for some, things, but not critical goals such as invading a neighboring state that's supposedly a threat to your country. So the amount of freedom and organizational independence that many of these PMCs, including regional security organizations like the Chechen Special Forces, that they possess is not natural. I mean, if you follow geopolitics for a very long time, which few commentators out there have, but this is just not normal. It's just not normal that a country of the kind of prestige that Russia has such distributed law enforcement and military capabilities. And I think that it definitely is a problem. It's already been a problem for the last 6 months. Max Weber, the famous sociologist who defined many things, one of the things he defined is sovereignty. How do you know a country is sovereign? How do you know that it exists, that it is a state? And he defined it as the monopoly over the legitimate use of force in a given territory. And I think that Russia has not had the critical components of that definition for, I think, already 6 to 12 months. So anyways, those are some of the big picture things. Where is Prigozhin right now? Who made the deal? How did this happen? Blah, blah, blah. All these nuances of the moment are less interesting to me than the bigger picture, the macro context, which is that this is invariably negative for the domestic stability of Russia. And it is a symptom of, I think, a bigger slide towards poor governance. And I'm using that term in very OECD, IMF term, language. I'm trying to restrain myself from getting into analogies that, resemble Mad Max, the Road Warrior future for this country.
Yeah, although they might be apt. I think you're absolutely right to bring up Weber's definition of sovereignty. I also saw Michael Kaufman had a great, apparently there's a Russian saying that those who served in the army don't laugh at the circus. I thought that was a really good summation of everything that's been happening right now.
Yeah.
But to your point about the PMCs, I mean, and before we just sort of head to the macro context, when the Russia-Ukraine war started, the argument that everybody that said that Russia was going to somehow win this conflict in the long run, their argument was predicated on the idea of numbers. And Russia does have a very large military force on paper, but the number of actually elite, actual professional soldiers is much smaller relative to the size of the army on paper. And most of them have already been deployed and been ground up in this meat grinder of a conflict. So if you're Putin and you love constraints, you either engage PMCs who can give you the fighters that you need to continue the war, or you preserve sovereignty over the state. And I mean, I think that's one of the ways that this is a huge inflection point, because you're right. Until now, he was able to succeed in this balancing act where the Kremlin was still in power. All of these warlords, they weren't really warlords yet, right? They hadn't challenged the leader. Putin was still leading the way. Now Pandora's box is open. And the idea that you can put all these things back into Pandora's box, in which case apparently Pandora's box is in Belarus, a real come down from the original myth that Pandora's box is in Belarus. But I just don't see how you go back from this. And whether it's Prigozhin or somebody else, I mean, as you said, it doesn't seem like Putin and the Kremlin is going to be able to survive this. It's just kind of what flavor of Russian government do we get after this? Do we get a new dictator that is supported by the oligarchy and the army? Do we get warlordism throughout the country? Do we get a proper civil war like 1917? I mean, what are your scenarios, and what do you think is most likely?
So before we go there, I think we still need to convince our listeners that this is bad for Putin, and I kind of laugh at the fact that we have to do that.
Oh yeah. Okay.
But I just think that it's not settled. The debate is not settled that this is a negative. I mean, I thought the conflict was negative on February 24th, 2022. That's why my first note to clients on February 24th, 2022 literally listed all the conflicts where Russia was engaged in a war of aggression, not defense, important distinction. They were playing offense, not defense. And almost every single one of those wars over the last 200 years led to regime change in some shape or form. So that's the first. The second thing is, if you know anything about Russian history, you know that a weak, soft czar is not a czar who survives. This is very, very important in Russia, if in any other country. And when you have one of your lieutenants, one of your boyars, one of your kapos stand up against you, tries to go at the king, and then withdraws, and you're like, look, that was naughty. Please get a timeout in Belarus. That's weakness. I mean, like, you don't have to know Russian history. Please just watch some mafia movies, watch The Sopranos. You know, like, this is, you don't just, like, take a timeout in a neighboring state in Belarus and all is forgiven. I mean, they withdrew the indictment against the man. Apparently, he is not now being convicted of treason, and he doesn't have to defend himself in a court of law. So, to me, that is a sign of weakness that, given Russian history, and given that Russian population tends to, respect strong leaders, this is now the first time, really, that during Vladimir Putin's reign, he looks weak, and he looks like he is not in control of the situation. So I think that that's my case for why this is invariably negative for Russia. I mean, I don't know if you agree or if you have other ways to convince the multitudes of Putin apologists out there. And by the way, like, you and I disagree on many things about this conflict. I love when you say something like this, immediately the reaction is, well, these two guys are Westerners, cousin Jacob, cousin Marko. I mean, I think, for example, I think Ukrainian offensive will fail, whatever. There's many ways in which Western propaganda seeps through this issue. But I think that if you speak to many Russians as well and objective observers of this conflict, they will agree, this has weakened the Putin regime. I don't think that's a biased view.
No, I don't think so at all. And there's a lot of trolls out there in general, but I'm glad you brought us back down to earth for a second, because I disagree with you on some particulars, and we will get to the war in Ukraine and whether this opens up a potential opportunity for the Ukrainians, which I'm leaning in that direction right now, though it's a little too early to say. But you're right. One of the theories that has gained currency, at least on social media, and social media is not a real place, but I'm surprised at how loud this theory is that Putin orchestrated all of this, that this is something, intra-Russian conflict, and he needed Prigozhin to do this so that he could scare the military and so that he can get rid of the defense secretary and the chief of staff. And I've actually had people telling me, go check out this, Twitter profile or this theory. They really have the idea of what's going on here. And I can't disprove it. So I can't just tell you it's 100% not true. But I mean, let's just some basic facts. Like Wagner fighters killed Russian airmen. Okay, so Putin was cool with killing Russian airmen and killing whatever morale is left in the armed forces to do this. Russian bulldozers were tearing up the highways to Moscow. So they were doing that just so that they could convince us that was all sort of real. And now Prigozhin, he's not rehabilitated. He's quote unquote going to Belarus. He's probably going to be dead soon. Even if he's not dead, I mean, for all I know, he and Lukashenko are going to stage their own invasion of. I was thinking maybe Lukashenko will take the nukes that Putin deployed to Belarus, turn them around in Moscow, and it'll be Belarus marching to Moscow. They're right there on the Smolensk. Like, why not? But yeah, I mean, please feel free to take down that theory because it's gained a lot of currency, and it's just I don't see it based in fact, and people are latching onto it.
Again, maybe in some other country, sure, not in Russia. Russian history is a history of weak tsars, soft tsars. Once the boyars, once the other members of the aristocracy, of the elite, of the court, sniff out weakness, knives are up. And so the only way that this could have been orchestrated by Putin, here's a reasonable example. Let's say that he and Prigozhin had a deal. Hey, do a mutiny, do a rebellion. I won't support you, but, it's good for me. Then we cleanse some of the elites. And then Putin goes back on him and launches an airstrike on the highway and kills 20,000 of his troops.
Yeah.
Boom! Okay, yeah, well done. Soft clap for Vladimir. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. Nobody's going to go to jail for this. No one's going to get punished. And so I absolutely think that this is, a real threat. And it's sort of like a shift in elite consensus. And one of the things that I think is really relevant is to read Prigozhin's 30-minute speech that he had on, Friday night on Telegram, where he basically laid out the reasons he's doing this. And this is important because, he is a brutal mercenary who spent time in jail. He's a tough guy, a Siloviki, a mercenary. And so when he employs some of the criticism against Putin, it's really important because it widens the narrative and allows others to employ similar language. In other words, when some NGO head in St. Petersburg says that Putin invaded Ukraine for domestic reasons, no one's going to listen to that person in Russia for obvious reasons. They're seen as liberal Western Nazis. But no one's going to accuse Prigozhin of being any of that. There's an FBI arrest warrant for the man. And I think that this was also a very important point that weakens the regime and that allows other members who are either in the elites or adjacent to it to start employing the same criticism. I mean, his speech was extraordinary. I read the whole thing. I translated the whole thing for clients. I actually also sent some of the snippets on Twitter. And basically what he said is that there were no Nazis. There were no Nazis in Ukraine. There was no real threat to Russia. That Russia didn't just go into Ukraine for domestic political reasons, but that it's been looting Donetsk and Luhansk, both before and after the war. And one of the most egregious points that he made, which I don't understand why it wasn't translated in the West, because it serves West's purposes. But he said, look, we're fighting in eastern Ukraine. Most of the people we're fighting are co-ethnics. They're Russians. We're killing Russians. We're fighting against Russian speakers, Russian ethnics. And, these are statements that when they're uttered by a nationalist, a person that most Russians would probably conceive of being a patriot, albeit with gross ambitions, I think that it's really relevant. And I think it definitely weakens Putin. So we need to really convey that because you're right. There's all sorts of nonsense on Twitter. And I think the best tweet of the weekend is Branko Milanovic, by the way, famous economist who studies inequality. And he mentioned on Twitter, if Putin died, his apologists would argue that it was some form of, fourth-dimensional. Oh, you think he's dead? Nah, bro. He's still up there or down there, He just went to negotiate with Satan, but he'll be back. Don't worry about it. I mean, it's like, no matter what happens, and that's when you understand that a lot of apologists for Russia and Putin are basically members of a cult. Because no matter what happens objectively, they're going to spin it as somehow being positive for Russia and for the regime.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Prigozhin speech because this is one of the things that that I've been on since the beginning and that I haven't seen out there, because it wasn't just the first speech. Like even after Putin gave his speech saying this is treason and we're going to punish all these people, Prigozhin had a response out within an hour on Telegram, and he kept on pumping out audio messages and video messages. If you went on Russian news, Russia Today covered all this shit. Now, they had other features and things like that, but at the bottom banner, they were covering what was going on. So the Russian people knew that something was going on. And that's really weird because like Putin has spent, I'll hand it to you in 1 second. Just want to say that like Putin has spent since 2017 literally severing Russia's internet from the rest of the world internet so that he can have a switch on the Russian internet that he can turn on and off and not have this kind of information pass. And so like the fact that Prigozhin is just out there, his message was out there. He got to say whatever message he wanted. He got to define the story. That's not the sort of warlord monopoly of violence. That's just you've lost the monopoly on communication. You're not controlling the narrative. And then I was wondering then if maybe somebody in Moscow would execute the coup because they could see, oh, okay, now suddenly the information realm is open too. But I think that's another chink in Putin's armor that people aren't talking about enough.
Such a great point. And, as somebody who lived through the Yugoslav wars and as a Serb, I can tell you that there was a moment in the Yugoslav Yugoslav conflict, where the nationalists, quote unquote patriots, turned on Slobodan Milosevic. There was this idea that he betrayed, that he wasn't patriotic enough, and we've been seeing snippets of this over most of this conflict with these war bloggers, military bloggers, who became extremely popular, who would criticize the defense ministry. They would publish real figures of deaths or destroyed tanks and destroyed military equipment. And so there's this gnawing chips, as you say, it's chinks in the armor that are happening in the narrative that Putin is the supreme patriot. In other words, what Prigozhin is doing is he's trying to out-patriot the supreme patriot by saying, like, we need regime change because you are not pursuing Russian interests. And I would objectively agree with Prigozhin. I would agree that it is not in Russia's interest to be pursuing conflict in Ukraine in the shape and form that they're doing it. So there's an objective reality that, I agree with Prigozhin, not on ideological grounds, but just like on objective grounds. And so this is a real problem for Putin because, again, it widens what you can say and who can say it. And you're absolutely right that it's very interesting that this is being covered widely in Russia. And I don't see how this is not a good thing. Now, again, too many people are focusing on what happened over the weekend and whether it was a coup or not, or whether it succeeded or not. That's fine. It didn't succeed. Putin's not going to go tomorrow. But that's not the point. The point here is, where is Russia going? And then we can open up that discussion, because what you're asking, your big question is, what are the scenarios here? And there's a multitude of them.
Yeah, I mean, well, one last thing on now before we go to that. And by the way, I think it's too early to say whether it succeeded or not. This is why it does kind of matter. Like, what was Prigozhin's goal here? Was his goal to make sure that he didn't get taken out and have a safe place and have his fiefdoms in Africa? Did he actually have ideas that he was going to replace Putin? Did he think he was going to encourage a palace coup? Is he hoping to be one of the strongmen that is around to take over once Putin gets obliterated? Like, I think it's a little early to say he's failed because we don't know what his objectives are. But before we get to the macro and turn into what this means for Russia, for the war in Ukraine, talk about how this maps perfectly onto NBA basketball, of course. What about Belarus? Because Lukashenko coming in from stage left was sort of the cherry on top for that. I really don't understand what's going on here now too. Why does Lukashenko suddenly matter? Why is he there? This idea that he could have brokered it and convinced Putin not to kill him. I mean, Lukashenko's been a lapdog this entire time. Do you have any account for why Belarus is involved here, or why anyone gives a shit what Lukashenko says suddenly?
Well, no, I mean, I suspect that whatever deal Prigozhin got was a pretty sweet deal. Again, the fact that Russia simply didn't mobilize its air force and attack Wagner troops tells us of how weak the state is. I don't think it's that they were not capable of doing it. I think my first reaction is they didn't want to do it because they need the 25,000 troops. I mean, it's that simple.
Yeah.
We need every soldier for the conflict in Ukraine. So we cannot have, we cannot just destroy it. We cannot have a conflict on M4 highway to Moscow. This is unacceptable. So I think that Prigozhin, whatever deal he got, I think it's a sweetheart deal. I think the Belarus thing is just completely irrelevant. I think Lukashenko was told, hey, Prigozhin is going to just kind of chill in Belarus for the next couple of months, and then he's probably going to go, maybe to Africa or maybe somewhere else. I have no idea. I don't really care. I think it's interesting. But again, I keep going back to what I care about, which is what's the second and third derivative of this, is that everybody else, all the other Prigozhins in Russia, all the other members of the elite, and I'm not talking about oligarchs, I'm talking about the Siloviki, members of the national security establishment in Russia, who also happen to be billionaires. All of them are watching this, and what are they doing right now? They're beefing up their personal PMCs, of which there are many. There's rumors out there. There's a Rand report that, basically said Shoigu has his own PMC. Gazprom has a couple of, which, probably means that every single member of the Siloviki probably has some form of a PMC. Every one of them is now sitting there thinking, interesting. This is important. Because remember, and this was the point, this opens up now the narrative and the possibilities in Russia. And the Bolsheviks came after the initial revolution, so like the initial revolution happens, everybody observes how Putin handles it. Once they see that you can get a sweetheart deal if you do this, the probability of somebody else attempting it increases. That's just natural fact of mathematics.
All right, well, let's turn then to the macro, because I think you and I are in agreement about where this goes in the long term, like the long term. Like I think like Putin, he can't, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, maybe he can hold on for a little while longer. But I mean, I don't see how the Kremlin comes back from this. But what happens in the short term? Because I don't have a strong view on where this goes next. It's literally just trying to diagram scenarios. I mean, I could think straight up revolution. It could be, a real civil war. It could be, Russia just becomes a bunch of different warlord states and ostensibly looks sort of put together, but is not. And anytime there's a disagreement, you'll get convoys rolling down the wrong highway. What are your scenarios, and what are you leaning towards in terms of likelihood?
I don't think that's the short term, Jacob. Like, I think the short term, let's define the short term as the rest of this year, and let's define the short term as 12 months. I'm not sure that this cascades right away into more rebellion, more mutiny. I think in the short term, there is a Ukrainian offensive that is probably the most important. And by the way, Prigozhin is clearly a very smart man because he timed his exit correctly. If he was like a CEO of a tech company, wow, you did it at a right moment. He had a great exit. Because why? Because, again, Putin needs those 25,000 troops. There's a Ukrainian offensive going on right now. And so it was the moment when he could extract probably the most out of the Russian government if he wanted to sort of, bargain with them. It was a really painful moment to do this. But that moment continues, and I think that over the next 6 to 12 months, I can see Russian elites, military, law enforcement coalescing against the common goal of defeating the Ukrainian offensive. So I don't know if in the very short term we will see more of this. Maybe, maybe not. I probably lean towards the side that there's kind of a lull after the storm, but there's a hurricane coming over the sort of medium term. And what does that hurricane look like? Well, everything from a gentlemanly, civilized exit for President Putin, a sort of a Khrushchev scenario, but much more lucrative. Maybe the Yeltsin scenario would be a better actual comparable, because I think Yeltsin was removed in a palace coup. So, you basically say like, look, your family's good. You can stay a billionaire. Everything is good. Don't worry about it. Like, what real estate do you want to keep? What bank accounts do you want to keep? Just, like that kind of a exit. And by the way, when this happened to Yeltsin, what Yeltsin was really concerned about was his daughter, was his family. And they were taken care of. I mean, they were given sort of guarantees that they'll be fine. So there is a precedent for it. Putin participated in that precedent, and I think that is still an option. And then on the other side of this is what I call the Mad Max Road Warrior future, where Mel Gibson roams the highways of Russia searching for gasoline, from like carcasses of discarded Ladas. Like that is the variance, Jacob. Everything in between. And so, it's not good. It is not good for Russia. At the very minimum, the future, the rest of this decade, is likely going to involve guys like us basically making fools out of ourselves, trying to forecast the future. But it's not going to be China, U.S., it's not going to be this. It's going to be what the future of Russia. Russia is the largest country in the world, number one. Number two, it's the largest exporter of commodities. I'm not just talking energy, but metals as well. Number three, it's the 12th largest economy in the world. I know it's not a big deal, but it's number 12. It's not number 30. Number four, it's an important plug on potentially tens of millions of economic and war refugees into Europe. So if you want to think about things like North African and Middle East migration to Europe, which is top of mind to Europeans, let's talk about Central Asia. Many states that are failed or are going to have problems with climate change or access to water they can walk on flat land to Europe. Russia has been a very important migration route for thousands of years. And if Russian state collapses, you suddenly have no plug, no security on these borders. And then the fifth issue is that if there's a failed state in Russia, or if there's regime change, that regime could then implement a 180-degree turn in policy. It could put China in a very, very precarious, difficult situation. I mean, the permutations of where this goes are really vast and are difficult to forecast. And I think that this will be the most important geopolitical issue of the time. I think that everyone obsessing about China-US right now as being the premier geopolitical risk of the rest of this decade, I think could very well be wrong. And that includes us to an extent, because it's not like, we're not here just to do hot takes. I mean, like, you and I also participate in focusing on China-US. It is important. But a destabilization of Russia, I think, is a really, really important issue that investors and markets and policymakers will obsess about for the rest of the decade, if that's where this is headed, and I think it is.
Well, your point on China, you're preaching to the choir there, because this is one area where I'm even more strident than you are, which is I've put it at I have to put it at 1% because I can't put anything at a 0% chance. But I don't think China's invading Taiwan this decade. Probably not until 2035 at the absolute earliest. If you look at, and to your point about history, what are the most important moments in history for the past 100 years? You can make an argument that the two most important are, number one, 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the world that ushered in. And you can argue number two is 1917 and the fall of the Russian Empire and the rise of communism and everything that did too. Mackinder wasn't right that whoever controls the heartland controls the world. But if the heartland is in chaos, and you didn't even mention nuclear weapons, which is the one that really keeps me up at night. What if we've got dudes like Prigozhin running around with access to a tactical nuke? It really does make the Mad Max scenario not just a joke.
No.
But yeah, I mean, this kind of destabilization and this kind of market,
listen, I'm not using it as a joke. I'm using it as a shorthand. For those of you who have not watched Mad Max: The Road Warrior, please join the revolution. What are you doing? But look, what I'm getting at here is that I think that Russian history has examples of where this happens. And I think that it's going to be very difficult to avoid it, especially now that Putin has elected to react to this particular challenge to authority in a very weak way. The big issue to me is that the markets are unlikely to react to this on Monday. So, if we want to talk about market reaction in the near term, I don't think that this is a catalyst for anything. In fact, every step of the way, the correct way to trade the Ukraine war was to fade geopolitical risk premium. So, for example, shorting bonds at the onset of the conflict, you had people talk about nuclear strikes, and the bond market sold off. The long end of the bond market sold off, which is crazy. That is the premier geopolitical safe haven. Didn't care. Cared more about Jay Powell and inflation than nuclear weapons. That tells you that the bond market was laughing at the conflict in Ukraine. He basically said, this is a nothing burger. Then shorting oil, harvesting the collapse in geopolitical risk premium from June onwards of 2022, where the oil markets, which had rallied as geopolitical risk built up, they basically collapsed because the reality was China wasn't doing well and there was no actual loss in supply. So the conflict, where the second largest exporter of oil is engaged in a conflict next door, it didn't even touch any of the supply. And then the final moment was to bet against the risk premium that had seeped into European markets. So going along European assets from September onwards, all the narrative Europe will deindustrialize was basically idiotic. So now the problem is this. I struggle to find what other geopolitical alpha to harvest, because the market has correctly, in my view, assessed that the conflict is really bound by material constraints. So what are you supposed to short or go long? What is left? There are some equity markets, like Nordics, Central Eastern European ones, that haven't recovered to their pre-war levels. So maybe you could go long some of those. But that's, like if I show up in front of a pension fund or a sovereign wealth fund and tell them to go long Finland, I'll get laughed out of the room. I mean, this is a joke. I do think that there's a setup to be long oil. But I don't think the catalyst is Prigozhin and the coup in Russia. I mean, like the setup is Chinese policymakers are being forced to stimulate. And on top of that, the recession in the United States has been a very incorrect forecast, and all the investment banks are now extending their recession calls into 2024. So maybe there's a catalyst for oil, but in the near term, I think that this uncertain future of Russia is difficult to figure out unless one thing happens. I don't think this will happen, but Putin could listen to our podcast. I'm sure he's an avid listener. And Vladimir Putin might say, like, wait a minute, these two jokers are making fun of me. Oh my God, I've made a mistake. I need to now triple down. He launches general mobilization, tries to prove, jokers like us wrong, and goes into Ukraine again with the intention of taking out Kiev. Let's say that happens. I don't think that will happen. I don't think Russia has the capability to do that. But let's say it does happen. I think that at this point, the risk skew is towards increase in geopolitical risk premium. In other words, even though I'm sanguine, I'm telling you, I have nothing to do with my sanguine view. It's all dissipated. There's no more alpha to harvest by saying, like, the war in Ukraine is limited. There's just downside risk. And so even though I don't believe in that downside risk and I think probability is low, I think that that's the only thing somebody could put on in an options market, put on some bets by betting that actually what happens is the low probability event. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. I have a few thoughts on that. The first is I think you're right in the sense that it might be a catalyst for some small moves, but it's almost too late to do that. So for instance, at CI, we are already long natural gas and wheat because of other market dynamics. And this is not going to be a catalyst, but this could support those positions. Like, we're not mad about seeing this when we have those positions on the books, but you're probably not going to open those positions on Monday just because something happened with Russia and Ukraine. But in general, I do think there is something to be said here for commodities, because if we go toward the Mad Max Fury Road thing, and Russian farmlands getting torn up, or you're getting, somebody launches a tactical nuke, or a nuclear plant explodes in Russia because it's not handled well, and suddenly they lose a bunch of farm. There are commodities where Russia is a major player where you can start to maybe think about it. But again, that's a difficult game to play. But I think it's also, I mean, a weaker Russia is good for some other powers. It could arguably be good for the European Union. It could be good for Turkey. It could even be good for China if it wants to go in and take back Vladivostok or assert control over some of these very mineral-rich parts of Eastern Russia. I think it's a good segue though. Also, though, into... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I would just say it's very binary. I think... So, first of all, I think Chinese stimulus and U.S. recession are going to determine the path of commodities much, and also the Fed, given its impact on the dollar. I think those three macro issues will impact the path of commodities much more in the next 6 to 12 months. I think the Russian destabilization, when I speak to, for example, longer-term investors with longer-term horizons, I have been using Russian destabilization well before this coup as one of the pillars of the commodity bull market, secular bull market. I mean, it's the least relevant, in my view, of the many pillars. We're in a capex-driven cycle due to redrawing of supply chains, the green energy revolution. All those things are very bullish commodities. But this is one of them. So I don't think that we can really, you're right, we can't trade this in the commodity markets right now. But I think in the long term, even as a scenario of just regime change, a gentlemanly, civilized regime change, will likely usher in a period of insecurity in Russia. So you don't need Mad Max scenario. Like some form of governance instability will restrict flow of capital, both human and financial, into the regions of Russia that are required to produce commodities. Like very simple, very nuanced, very non-sensationalist view. Just uncertainty, just governance uncertainty in Russia, because you had a transition to a different regime, even a pro-business, pro-Western regime. There will be a moment of incoherence that I think will come at a really bad time, given the demand for commodities that is stable in the world right now. But yes, that is more of a longer term theme.
Yeah. There are a few commodities where, like wheat, for example, where Russia is going to affect things.
Yeah, and especially because of the deal and so on. I mean, there's a lot of things. Yes, agreed.
Yeah. Well, and platinum, like if you're a U.S. startup and you're thinking about platinum, like you're trying to reshore or nearshore platinum group metals mining, like yeah, that's one where you might like want to do the capex, because if Russia's going to be crazy, like it's going to suck to set that sort of operation up. But 5-10 years from now, if you can afford to front load the capital now, like that's probably a good investment. But I think what you're talking about is also a good segue for Ukraine, because that's also extremely important and maybe more tradable here. I guess the first, has this changed at all your opinion of it? It doesn't sound like it's changed your lack of optimism for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But what do you think this means for the Russia-Ukraine war?
No, I think definitely objectively this is a positive. There's an issue of morale, which is very difficult to quantify. Morale and esprit de corps is very important in trying to assess competence of militaries. It's not just order of battle analysis. It's not just about tanks on one side of the ledger, tanks on the other. It's also, are people driving these tanks willing to drive into danger? And I think when you see one of the most elite forces of the Russian military, as you mentioned, Wagner, contemplating a coup, that's a problem. So I think objectively this does increase the odds that the Ukrainian offensive is successful. I think that, my assertion last time we talked about this a month ago was that the Ukrainians are going to face a lot of challenges that are sort of built into the conflict in the 21st century between these two countries, which is that defense wins. It's lower cost technologies have advanced in terms of defense. They haven't really advanced in terms of offense. Air cover that Ukrainians don't have. Air assets that the Russians do have, both helicopter and ground assault aircraft, which, by the way, I mentioned on the podcast, and they have proven to be critical in the conflict thus far. All of that, I think, is still there, but definitely I would agree with you that this, perhaps opens up the possibility that there is such a collapse in morale that there are breakthroughs in various parts of the offensive, and so that's something we need to watch. Now, if you look at the map, Ukrainian counteroffensive has been, I think, a failure thus far in terms of the territory seized. That could change, and that's why I think it's important to kind of like look at a snapshot right now. It's June 25th. Let's see where we are in July 25th, and then August 25th. So we can measure the success very easily. We just look at the map.
Yeah, and I mean, the rejoinder to that is, the Ukrainians still have not really deployed the bulk of these new battalions that they've trained in force. I wonder if that explosion of that dam messed up some of their plans a little bit, or if they really are just taking it easy, if they were trying to exploit a weakness, and if they didn't find one, they were just going to sit tight. But I think your morale point is so important, because everybody, I think, has in their minds that this is going to be a meat grinder conflict. It's going to drag on and on and on. And that's what Russia wants. That's the thing that Russia's playing for. But just look at what Wagner just did in Rostov. There was no resistance. No, exactly. They went in and took over the military headquarters of a city of 1 million plus people. And another example here, it's very different, but it also has some weird overtones. Think back to the way that ISIS took over parts of Iraq and Syria. We had spent billions arming the Iraqi army and training them and all these other things. And it wasn't because ISIS beat them. It was because they gave up. They didn't want to fight. They didn't even want to try. And this goes back to the information campaign. If the Russian soldiers are on the front lines and they're seeing, so Prigozhin's over here. We're tearing up highways in Moscow. Like, what is going on? I'm really going to fight these Ukrainian fanatics who are coming across the border who also speak the same language that I do. If it's going to happen for the Ukrainians, it's probably going to happen fast and hard, and it's going to happen in a very short amount of time.
And listen, I love that. I love this, because let's put these views up like this is it. But don't come to me in a month from now and tell me, there's this other dam that blew up. No. This is it now. This is it. This is the next 30 days. If the Ukrainians stall and we're listening about 8 more villages that were conquered, I don't want to hear villages. I want to hear towns, and I want to see the land corridor to Crimea cut.
Cities.
Let's see some of that. And I still doubt that will happen. But your point about morale is important. Morale is sort of a non-linear, event. And so when it bursts, it bursts. Like the one example you could have added to the great ISIS example is Afghanistan, and what happened when Taliban just took over, and everybody in the U.S. is, but how did this happen? Again, we spent billions of dollars training the Afghan army. So we're going to see this in the next 30 days. We're going to know if the Ukrainian offensive is successful or not. my concern with the Ukrainian offensive is that I think it's also not. I think it's premature. Jacob, I just don't think that they've trained enough troops for an assault along a front line that's as long as it is. And so I think that had the Ukrainians just waited, like, let's say 2 to 3 years, I think they could have had the kind of breakthrough you're imagining, which would have been just collapse of defenses of Russia. But I almost feel like Ukraine and Zelensky are like the CEO of a venture-backed SaaS business that needs to prove revenues. They're being pushed by their investors to do this. This is what's kind of unfair to Ukraine. It's that there is political pressure from the US, but particularly Europe, to show a return on the investment in Ukraine. And I think that, the timing is not bad given what's happening in Russia, but I still think that in 2 to 3 years, Ukraine could have been in a better position, or even maybe 12 months from now, to do the kind of assault you're talking about. Bakhmut in the West is seen as a meat grinder for Russia, but it was a meat grinder for Ukraine as well. Again, for no good strategic reason. I think Zelensky committed himself to Bakhmut for political reasons. He wanted to show that Ukraine can withstand this assault, and I think he threw a lot of experienced troops there. So a lot of the newly found regiments you're talking about might have fancy Western weapons, but they don't necessarily have combat experience.
While you were talking about Afghanistan, I couldn't shake this idea of the Taliban as the U.S. equivalent of the Wagner group, but we don't have to go too down that rabbit hole. I think you're right about Ukraine having 2 or 3 more years. But, if they had 2 or 3 more years, if I had $2 or $3 billion, if you owned an NBA basketball team, like, they didn't have the 2 or 3 years. I think the question now for Ukraine is, it's easy for me to sit here and say, okay, now's the opportunity. Find the weak point, bust through Russian morale, all these other things. But to your point, if Zelensky, the software tech CEO, contracted, Perch Perspectives for geopolitical consulting advice, I would say, hey, maybe let the Russians go to hell in a handbasket. Maybe just set up shop and defend what you need to defend, and let them destroy themselves, because they will probably in the long run. The only thing they had going against you was that they had more numbers. That's all nullified now by everything that's going on internally. So you just need to make sure that, like you said, if Putin goes full on, third mobilization, that you can defend yourself in your current position.
Well, and by the way,
I take your point.
But Jacob, what you're talking about now, we can actually specifically say something else. Ukrainian offensive is a form of a threat to Russia. Specifically, when you think about Crimea, and I've brought this up to you before. I cannot prove this, but qualitatively, Russians do see a difference between the conquered territories. Crimea is seen as part of Russia. That is just unassailable. You will have liberal pro-Western Russians say that. Donbas is seen as something kind of like that, where the Russian speakers were discriminated by Kiev linguistically and so on. And so there's an element of defense. The territories of Zaporizhia and Kherson are just seen as vessels, as tools. Zaporizhia as a land bridge corridor to Crimea, and then parts of Kherson as a buffer to secure Crimea and access to water. Why do I say this? I say this because the offensive by Ukraine now, this offensive right now, there is an element where it will unify the Russian society and boost morale, because there are certain territories that Russians really care about more than others. And if Ukrainians threaten Crimea or Donbas, so beyond Kherson and Zaporizhia, I think that it will have a unifying effect. And this is where I don't think you can really have regime change in Russia in the midst of the war. I think what needs to happen is the war needs to ossify. You could, listen, it's not a 0% probability. I'm just saying, the war is going on. Ukrainians are attacking. And I think a more likely scenario is one where war ends or it ossifies. And then you have 6 to 12 months where the Russian population takes a breather, looks around and says, wait a minute, what the hell did we just do? Why did we lose anywhere between 50 and 200,000 troops, depending whose numbers you believe? Why did we do this? For what reason? Those moments of contemplation don't happen in the middle of a war where, your hold on Crimea is now threatened by an advancing Ukrainian army. And that's where Kiev could have been perhaps more strategic, and where ossifying this conflict, not trying to reconquer territories, but letting Russia basically have a moment of reflection. That moment of reflection will lead to more domestic political unrest. It's not going to lead to revitalization.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder if what has happened in Russia gives Zelensky the space to say that now, that he doesn't have to go back to his German backers and his American backers and say, look, like what we're doing is working. We don't have to bust through. They're going to destroy themselves. Stop pushing me. I don't need to do this right now. I just need to hold the lines. It could open up that possibility.
You know what? I don't see that level of nuance in Ukrainian leadership. And, I don't want to criticize them. They're fighting for their land, for what, they believe is theirs. And I get that. But there's a lot of emotion and a lot of political considerations. I think it's very difficult for Zelensky to be strategic. I think he's being very tactical instead. But again, if I was running Ukraine, I probably would just say look, let's continue to build our offensive capabilities. They're not ready yet. And while we're building them over the next 12, 24, 36 months, I think that Russian society will turn on itself. Look, examples of this are all over the place. Again, I mentioned Serbia, I mentioned Yugoslavia. Milosevic wasn't toppled in the middle of the war. He was toppled after 12 months after the 99 NATO war. It was after that lull where people have a chance to look around and say, wait, what was the point of this? And I think when Russians look around, they're going to ask themselves, we lost somewhere around 100,000 people. We lost somewhere around 100,000 people for what reason? For what reason? So that we can get the West Virginia of Europe, as I've always, and no offense to West Virginia, go Mountaineers. But Donbas is irrelevant. And I don't want anyone to start telling me about natural resources. It's got coal. That's it. You don't need coal in the 21st century, for God's sake. Coal is everywhere. And one country that certainly doesn't need coal is Russia. Russia did not invade Donbas and Crimea for natural resources. In other words, Russian people will look around and ask themselves, 12 months after the war ends, why did we do this? Was it worth it? And the answer, I think, is a clear no.
You're being too flippant on coal. They're North Vietnam's having power shortages, and U.S. companies are very mad about it because the coal can't get to the right place. But I take your point about West Virginia.
Go Mountaineers.
The last thing, go Mountaineers. It's a beautiful, West Virginia's a beautiful place. I've spent a lot of time there in my youth.
Donbas is as well. Rolling hills, hardworking people. It's not going to make or break Russian status as a great power. I think that's my point.
Yeah.
And neither is Crimea, by the way.
Yeah. Before we turn to some basketball stuff or just opening it up, Matt Pines, who's a frequent guest on this podcast, had one question that I wanted to raise. And Matt, we're probably not going to address it in depth because I'm still kind of learning both about it. But there's been a lot of controversy about the collapse of the dam and about the effect on nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. And did the Russians do this to sabotage the cooling ponds there? And there's some disturbing stuff out there about that. There was also in the Senate, Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal, I'm forgetting his first name, they proposed, I think, a bill on Friday that said if Russia ever used tactical nukes, that the United States and NATO should consider it an attack on NATO, and it would trigger Article 5, which is sort of an interesting thing. It goes back to that whole, use of nuclear weapons and the Russians moving nuclear weapons to Belarus, things like that. I have generally downplayed the nuclear issue throughout this entire conflict. It was really, if you go back to April, May, that's what people were really talking about. That's what got you on television if you were willing to say, oh, Russia could use nuclear weapons. So I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but there is some interesting stuff in there. Are there any red lines that NATO, I don't know, I'm throwing that out there just for you to riff a bit because I'm also still chewing on it, but I didn't want to leave Matt's question at least unaddressed.
So I don't know about the dam or the cooling towers of Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. I can't really speak to that. I think the issue of nuclear weapons, look, I think if Ukrainian offensive is extremely successful and it looks like Crimea is going to be threatened, I think the odds of a tactical nuclear strike do rise. Because again, I think the Russians see the territories they've gained in three tiers. Sort of critical parts of Russia, Crimea. And you don't want to start giving the rest of the world this notion that Russian state can be attacked. I think Donbas is somewhere in between. I think they're willing to lose some territory in Donbas. That's fine. Mm-hmm. And then, Zaporizhia and Kherson, the two oblasts, as I said, are only there for functional reasons not political. Remember, Kharkiv, a very important oblast adjacent to Donbas, was lost like this because Russians gave it up. It's not because Ukrainians were necessarily that good at fighting. The Russians just looked around and said, Kharkiv is a nice to have, not a must have. They withdrew. So I think Ukraine gets threatened. The odds that Russians, use tactical nuclear weapons, they have to rise. It is the kind of use of tactical nuclear weapons they would have if you invaded Rostov, if you invaded St. Petersburg. They would use tactical nuclear weapons. And that's why you and I have talked about this. That's why I think Western support for Ukraine has always been limited in terms of offensive capabilities. Because to Ukrainians' credit, they believe Crimea is theirs. They're not going to stop. And if you give them the tools to invade Crimea, I don't think you can fault them if they try to reconquer it. So there's this hesitancy in the West to give Ukrainians the kind of tools that would enable that scenario to be true. Now, if you have a complete collapse of morale on Russians, if you are right about your scenario, what's interesting about this is that is the most risky scenario. So if you are trying to gauge market reaction, a incredible success by Ukrainian offensive is the most, I think, market negative scenario. That's what's ironic. Now, nobody in the West really wants to kind of say that out loud. It's a little politically incorrect because we all have to support Ukraine. But the reality is, if Ukrainian offensive suddenly reaches that tipping point where Russians are fleeing Crimea, I mean, that's a scenario where I can see Moscow using tactical nukes. Now, what will be the reaction of NATO? There is, I think, zero chance we, put you and me in danger because of Crimea. Like I'm sorry. There's no way that my kids in Los Angeles County are going to be at risk of Russian ICBM retaliation because Russians are defending what they believe is their territory in Crimea. It's not going to happen. So,
yeah.
So good job, Lindsay. Good luck with that one. But I guess no one's going to bomb. Wait, Lindsey Graham is South Carolina, right?
Yes, he's South Carolina.
Okay, well, easy for him to do that because no one's going to nuke South Carolina.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I'm sure. I bet Kim Jong Un has Charleston on his
he's got
weird
Austin.
little map.
We remember this from our Stratford days. Remember when he put like Los Angeles, Austin, and other, and then everybody made a joke that Kim Jong Un is clearly a Sooners fan.
Yeah. I still think one of the safer things you can do here, because no matter what scenario is right, and there's already been a premium in these equities, but German defense companies, Polish defense companies, even French defense companies, like all of this is good for them. Like they're going to spend more money, I think, in general, especially if things get squirrely in the United States. You've already got, Republicans talking about how we can't send more weapons to Ukraine. It's all costing too much money. I think European defense companies, if you're looking for a boring, non-sexy sort of equity position that's just going to keep on growing for the rest of the decade, I think that's a pretty safe bet.
Yeah, don't disagree. My team wrote about that last year, and I 100% agree. And by the way, you just reminded our viewers or listeners to another reason that Ukrainians are under pressure. That U.S. election and the election season is, they have this window of opportunity to gain as much as they can before things, the support from U.S. maybe gets put into doubt. So
yeah,
time is of
again. If Zelensky could think strategically and not tactically, I would advise him to bet on Europe, not on the United States.
But that's
it's not a sure
though.
bet.
You know what? I hear you. It's just it's difficult because Europe, from a Ukrainian perspective, Europe has been a poor ally. I mean, Minsk 1 and 2 were negotiated by France and Germany, gave Donbas essentially a veto over foreign policy of Ukraine. So Zelensky, naturally is going to want American support rather than European support. Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, these are all countries that kind of agree with that view that Europeans are not very reliable allies when it comes to Russia. And I think that, that's fine. We cannot criticize Ukrainians for having that view. It's just that the American support of Ukraine, while much, much more robust, is also liable to swing wildly. And so that's where I agree with you. I agree with you. It's just that I also understand why Ukrainian leadership doesn't agree with us.
Anything else serious before we get a little silly at the end that we didn't cover, Marko?
I mean, yeah, I think we didn't really talk about China a lot about this. I think when we think about the second and third derivative outcomes of what's going on here, we're talking about deteriorating political situation in Russia. We're talking about, impact on commodities over the long term, supply of commodities given the capex cycle. I think another one is China. And you mentioned, your view that China will not invade Taiwan for the rest of this decade. I agree with you. I don't think how anything that's just happened over the last, 24 hours or 16 months would embolden anybody to launch an offensive operation, particularly against an island. If Ukraine was difficult, imagine doing so against an island. But in addition to that, I think you have to really assess, if you're sitting in Beijing, did we bet on the right guy? And if this conflict is increasing the domestic insecurity in Russia, is it time to put pressure on Russia and say, look, just declare victory. Just call it quits, man. Declare victory. Defend against the Ukrainian offensive. Of course, don't withdraw, but really kind of, count your losses, declare victory, and end offensive operations in Ukraine so that you can consolidate the domestic regime. Why would I want to do that if I was China? Well, because, again, regime change often leads to 180-degree foreign policy turns, and Russian history is replete with this. Lenin pulled the plug on World War I. Yeltsin pulled the plug on the most defining foreign policy issue of the century, which was Cold War. These things really happen, and I mean, Prigozhin, let's say in the unlikely scenario Prigozhin became the president of Russia, I mean, this man is definitely up for the highest bidder. You know what I mean? I mean, he's saying, hey, America, let's talk. What do I get? And by the way, if you're Beijing, you're worried about this. If you're Kiev, you should be worried about this as well, because let me tell you right now, all the little Ukrainian flags next to people's Twitter, those are all going to disappear. They are. If the leader of the largest nuclear arsenal in the world shows up in Washington, D.C. and says, let's bargain. I'm telling you right now, no one's going to care in Washington, D.C. or Berlin about Donetsk and Luhansk, oblasts of Ukraine. People can't find on the map. Maybe some Ukrainians can because of Shakhtar Donetsk successes in Champions League. But I'm telling you right now, no one's going to care. People are going to go to Kiev and say, listen, bro, so you're going to give Russians what they want because China's more important to us. Sorry. So that
I think you're already seeing China hedge. They talked to Zelensky, they welcomed Blinken, even if there was some more back and forth about Biden's comments about a dictator. They welcomed the Germans. I mean, you can already feel China's getting more skeptical of the situation, I think.
Well, I think, I think China has been hedging on the Russian support really since the beginning of the war because they were shocked that he did it. I think this was not something they negotiated with Putin. I think that narrative is incorrect. And I think they were aghast at both the performance of the military and the way they executed this. If Putin ever told Xi about offensive operations in Ukraine, and I'm speculating now, and I have no view, I have no intelligence on this, but I suspect that he probably told him it would be limited and that it wouldn't be, as expansive as it was.
Yeah, I always end up being more optimistic about China, I think, than most in our circles, and that might be an analytical failing of mine. But this is progress for China, because the last time that Russia tried something like this, China got dragged into the Korean War and lost, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, fighting the Americans in Korea for absolutely nothing. And that was because the Soviets were the ones that egged on the North Koreans in 1951. It wasn't the Chinese. They wanted no part of it, and they were really pissed off about it the entire time. So if you've gone from getting dragged into, China's been importing some cheap oil. Yes, it's concerning, but they're not involved in any material way. That's actually progress, I think, in how China deals with these things. Even if China's still a very, very young country from a diplomatic, strategic, foreign policy perspective, too. So I would give them a little credit there. All right, before we close, because my child care counter is running out here. You compared. Oh, just do that? Well, she's not quite old enough for that trick yet, my friend. You said that. Well, tell the listeners who you think the Prigozhin metaphor is in the NBA.
I think it's definitely Paul George, PG-13.
Still think it's Paul George. Yeah.
I think Paul George was interviewed. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, on Twitter or whatever. But I think he was being interviewed when he played the Pacers or something, and he mentioned something like, "I put the banners in this building," and it was like, "What banners, bro? Like, I mean, like, you didn't even win an Eastern Conference final. What, like division banners?" So the man. So number one, number two, just front runner if there was one, and then finally, kind of disappears in the clutch. So I think that, to me, Prigozhin is Paul George, and Belarus, where he is ending up, is most definitely the Clippers. I'm very satisfied with this analogy.
Or it's clutch. So here's my metaphor, because I think it's more Ben Simmons and the Belarus is clutch sports here. Because Ben Simmons, Paul George, yes, like everything you said is true, but he was like actually really good. Like I watched those series, the Pacers with the Heat. He went toe to toe.
Yeah. Okay. So the Pacers series against LeBron is Prigozhin in Syria and Africa. Like there's
I think it's more like, and it's more like Ben Simmons had that whatever second team or whatever all team NBA. He had one good year, and then he was going to take over the league, and he was showing the videos of him working out. No, I can shoot the threes, and then it was nope. I'm here. I can make this big layup, and then I'm not going to take the layup. I'm going to go away. I'm working out again this year. Did you hear that he apparently photoshopped the videos of him working out this summer to look buff? I mean, that sounds like something Prigozhin would do. Like, I'm sure that dude is photoshopping just like Putin does, with the shirt off, sort of thing. And then I also threw out Brian Williams, Bison Dele, may he rest in peace, because he died in suspicious circumstances on a boat. So like the future for Prigozhin might be a little Bison Dele if you really want to get arcane.
I mean, as long as first shout out to Cade Cunningham. I don't know if anyone knows this, but look at the latest tweets from Cade Cunningham. He looks like he gained 50 pounds. There's a man who's not photoshopping. No, look, I think it's really interesting because, to me, like Prigozhin and his rise and fall, it's very much like built for the social media world, and I think that he himself knows this. And so I think that it's a really it's a fantastic way in which social media, in which information flows, in which, if I can use the term Kardashianization of reality, has now become something that even seeps into geopolitics, where somebody can attack the coup and then has this very much, it's almost like reality TV. He's going to be sequestered now in Belarus. I don't know. Like, is he going to do a TV show? Why not? Like, why wouldn't he come on our podcast? For example, your podcast. Why can't he be, cousin Yevgeny? We got cousin Jacob. We got cousin Marko. We got cousin Yevgeny. Like, it's fantastic. I mean, I think truly, it's an incredible world we live in, and hopefully it doesn't lead to a nuclear war. But I think that it's going to continue to be as conducive to following as a spectator sport as basketball. And that's why these analogies work. They work because it's become almost a caricature of itself. And if civilians weren't dying, and if there wasn't real human tragedy, it would be obviously a lot more fun, which is kind of a stupid thing to say, but it's an obvious one. I mean, one is not serious. The other one is serious.
Well, first of all, I'm happy for this to be our podcast. That's I'm ready for that. Anytime you're ready for it in your schedule, you just let me know. You know that. But what a delicious idea you've given somebody for a PhD dissertation. How Kim Kardashian created the Wagner Group and war in Russia. Like I can just see it right now. And that's as good a place to end as any, because you talked about, history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. Like we're in the farcical stage apparently.
Yeah, no, that's more of a PhD thesis of someone like in Grinnell College or something. But nonetheless, I think it's a good one. And look, I think, how do we wrap all this up? I think one thing that our listeners should take from this, I would say, is that don't focus so much on the first order effect. This would be, to me, a takeaway because, it was very interesting to me to watch Twitter focus on whether this coup succeeded or not. And then because it didn't, let's just say it didn't. Let's say that there's no doubt that it, and I fall in that camp, like whatever, man, he took his shot, respect the shot, he failed.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's not the point. The point is that one of the most advanced militaries in the world, the country with the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, just had a coup, just had a mutiny, whatever you want to call it. That is the bigger point. And I think when you try to combine investing in geopolitics, first order effects are almost always a reason to fade. You almost always fade them. And second of all, it's the second and third order effects where I think you make a lot of money. And so we need to start training, I think, people to think this way.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, I mean, this is the second order effect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Like
exactly
all the things that we talked about back then, like you should be appropriately positioned now for if things go a certain direction to go well. So now, like, as you said, this is now old. Like maybe Putin lasts for another 2 years. Maybe he lasts for 5. It's over. The Kremlin's over in this stage. So what is the second and third order effects of that being over, no matter what the details are and the Twitter trolls and everything else? I think that's in some ways, that's the most important thing we've said.
Agreed. And that's why on February 24th, I was writing about like how this will destabilize Russia, not just for the hot take, although sure, I enjoy making a hot take. People who know me, they know I enjoy hyperbole. It's fun. It's great to see trolls kind of lose their mind. But to me, it's really February 24th, Russia crosses the border in a really kind of incompetent way. You need to start thinking about those second and third order effects. Listen, granted, if you're just a day trader, you may not care. If you really are just concerned about the next week or next month or maybe next 3 months, maybe this is kind of a conversation that's not really relevant to you. Your so what is so limited and so focused on first order effect. And I understand it and I respect that. But a lot of investors that you and I talk to do have longer term time horizons, and they do care about the second derivative, which is 3 to 6 to 12 months, and then the third derivative, which is, over the next decade. If you're an institutional investor right now, commodities have been terrible this year and half of last year. So if you're an institutional investor right now, what do? Do you deploy more capital to commodity focused managers, as an example? That's where something like a third order effect matters, because once you lock yourself into those managers, that's more of a multi-year commitment than just a trade. All right. Well, I
want to pat myself on the back here because I just want to pat myself on the back here, which is I've done okay with trading commodities this year, but that's because it's a second, third order thing. And the last thing I want to say before I go to the screaming child in the background, which maybe will get edited out. I don't know. Maybe they'll leave it in for authenticity's sake. But people know one of the reasons our dynamic works, Marko, is because I'm mostly allergic to hyperbole, except when it comes to my NBA takes. And the title of my note that I sent out to clients yesterday was "The End of Russia as We Know It." So when I'm with you on the hyperbole train, we may disagree on a lot of the particulars.
This is why we're good cousins, because I throw bombs and you're like, what are you doing? Hey. And also, by the way, this is not how we play basketball. My game is very conservative, defense, low post. If I remember, Jacob, you shoot from the distance. You throw some haymakers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm bound by the constraints of my Jewish body, but I'm trying to do my best Larry Bird impersonation, right down to the trash talk, which is fun.
I don't know if it's Larry Bird. It was more ISO Joe, giving a shout out to your Atlanta roots. I always thought you had a little bit of a turnaround, like you had some of that Joe Johnson game, which is really frustrating to guard. So.
That's nice of you to say. When I was playing pickup last week, I wore my old vintage Dominique Wilkins shirt, and it was one of the best moments of my life because I made some fancy layup that I had no business making, but it was luck, and it went in. And the guy who was keeping score started, every time I got the ball for the rest of the run, was shut, the human highlight reel. I could have retired then, and it would have been great. All right, Marko, I got to go. Thanks for making time, and we'll talk to you soon. All right, man?
Oh, pleasure. Thank you so much, Cousin Jacob.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want. at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.